Welcome to our next lecture in our English and Women's Studies 3073 course. This topic is going to be on marriage in 19th century fiction. We've got three short fiction works that we're going to be discussing. And what I'd like to do is set up that discussion with some very generalized observations about the attitudes towards marriage, particularly between different classes in the 19th century. So in the first half of, or the first portion of our lecture, we'll be discussing things like the institution of marriage, what it was like in the 19th century, division of labor in marriage, women's educational opportunities, sex and childbirth, and we'll touch once again, even though we've already spent some time on it, on women in the literary marketplace, because that's kind of important for our writers. We have three of them coming up, and we will discuss them in turn. Marriage in the 18th and 19th century sort of strikes us as being really different from the way we view marriage today. Today, we view marriage as something that leads us, we hope, to emotional and sometimes even spiritual fulfillment. We look for emotional support with a partner. Attraction is very important to us. Romance, love, feelings of deep desire for the other person. And when I say this, you're like, yeah, duh, that's what everybody thinks. Well, it's not the way everyone has always thought about marriage. Marriage has been thought of throughout the ages very differently in different cultures in different parts of the world in different periods of time. So a lot of this depended on social class, but regardless, people 100 to 200 years ago certainly viewed marriage very differently than the way we did. I'll give you an example. Most weddings were not elaborate or even religious affairs in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. It simply wasn't something that people did in churches. They may have had a judge or a justice of the peace or maybe a minister preside over the wedding, but most weddings took place in homes, not in churches. They were not seen necessarily as being a highly religious affair. That's true with Caucasians or with African Americans or any number of different sorts of cultures and people. So the idea that we have a big giant wedding today, we spend I don't know what the average is, but spends thousands of dollars on weddings would be just something that would be beyond the pale for most of them. It was considered inviolable and for the most part irrevocable. In other words, marriage was something that you had to honor as a matter of law, but also as a matter of morality. Divorce was almost impossible for most of the earlier part of the country's history. In the late 1800s, it was possible to get a divorce. It was very, very difficult to do so. You had to pretty much have the other party's consent. And in some states, you had to prove basically infidelity, which is terrible because couples were forced to sort of get up on the stand, swear that their spouse had cheated on them when in fact they hadn't really cheated. They just didn't want to be married anymore. They couldn't have any other way out of it other than to swear that the person was... So you had to ruin somebody's reputation basically to get out of a marriage in some cases. But for the most part, it was considered inviolable and irrevocable. Divorce just simply was not an option. We would probably, in this day and age, be a little bit taken aback by the very practical view of marriage held by the affluent or middle classes. The middle classes and the upper classes would have viewed marriage, as we said with Susanna Rowson's novel, we would have seen them as, they would have seen it as something that was kind of a contractual, almost business-like in a weird kind of way. You needed to marry in your own status, in your own social circle. You needed to marry for money, which was a perfectly legitimate thing for them. You wouldn't, put it this way, you wouldn't necessarily marry only for money, but money was a perfectly acceptable reason to marry. The thinking being that after you married, you probably would be able to get along with that person. You would develop feelings for each other as time went on. You would become very good friends and companions and helpmates and things of this nature. It strikes us as being a little bit cold. Now, lower class, working class people got married just because they just fell in love. Okay, and that's, but upper class people would have said, if you get married only for love, that's something that low class people do, right? Only the poor people do that, and they can't control their urges. They can't marry for loftier reasons like practical, the union of two powerful families or things of this nature. So marriages were among the middle class and the upper middle class a lot less romanticized and less spiritualized toward the late 19th century. They began to be a little bit more in the 20th century. So the way we look at marriage is really kind of a very romanticized and almost spiritual. We're looking for our soulmate. Nobody would ever say they were looking for their soulmate very much in the 19th century. They would never have thought that way. They would have said, what? No. You have to find somebody you're compatible with, you're friends with, you have something in common with, you have the similar background. Religious views would be very, very important. But the marriage itself, the wedding itself, wouldn't have been a highly religious ceremony. We, on the other hand, have invested it with a great deal of passion, feeling, emotion, and spirituality, which really kind of wasn't the case 100 years ago or so, even 100 years ago. Now, when we talk about division of labor, we're talking about domestic division of labor. So the traditional roles that men and women had within marriages and how they changed in the 20th century. Now, we're dealing with the 19th century, but we're on the cusp with these three short stories of moving into the 20th century, and it's the 20th century that brought tremendous changes. Everybody knows that prior to the modern era, men worked outside the home, women worked inside the home. Men had the primary breadwinner job responsibility. Women had caretaking and homemaking and child rearing responsibilities, etc. That's very easy. Even in upper class, by the way, this division of labor idea ran the gamut frequently. Now, a lot of lower class families, women had to work outside the home, but there was still generally the idea that men should be the primary breadwinner, women should be the primary caretakers, and that didn't really changed too dramatically until the 20th century. And there were three reasons why it changed. One is the Industrial Revolution, of course, which allowed, see these ladies in the bottom there, allowed for women to have more time outside the home because the lady up above the ones cooking on the stove, hand washing, these ladies cooking on the stove with a really old antique late 1800s stove. What happened in the 20th century is you had the invention of modern appliances. So we had things like dishwashers and washing machines and dryers and refrigerators and things of this nature, which vastly speeded up housework. I mean, the one thing that probably changed the average housewife's life more than anything else, the washing machine. Almost everybody used to do their laundry on Mondays. They used to call it Blue Monday because it was just so horrible. People just dreaded Monday wash day. They'd eat leftovers because women would get up even before daylight and start the washing, and they had to wash it by hand and they had to dry it by hand, and it was just, then they had to iron it and all this. It was a day-long thing, and there was no time to cook. So on Mondays they did washing, and it was just a drudge. It was horrible. The cooking that had to be done was all from scratch, and all was, just a day long. You were up before dawn and you went to bed after dark. It was just long, long hours of all of this sort of thing. And then washing the dishes, of course, by hand and all that. The Industrial Revolution, especially in the 20th century, the invention of household products like that. Everything from toasters to coffee makers to, now microwave ovens and things of that nature. It greatly increased the amount of time that a person, decreased, I should say, the amount of time a person needed to spend doing typical domestic work. The second thing, of course, is the suffrage movement, right? The 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the vote. Very important step. We've just celebrated the 100th anniversary of that amendment. That's a big change as well. It wasn't the case that women never had the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment. The difference is that it was codified nationwide. That was the thing. You had states like Wyoming, territories they were at the time, Wyoming and other places that allowed women to vote, the vote, but it wasn't something that was a national guarantee. So the 19th Amendment passes in 1920. I guess we're coming up on the 100th anniversary. And then the third big thing is World War II. Believe it or not, World War II propelled an entire generation of young women into the workforce. You get the Rosie the Riveter situation over there, or poster over there in the bottom right. And what happened was that a lot of women were called upon to go into lines of work that they had not done before. They had to because they needed the people power to go do it when the men had been conscripted into the military service for the war. And so these women, many of them, went into factories and did pretty hard physical labor. And although most of those women, when the war was over, went on to become traditional housewives and may have given up that factory work or whatever, that wartime job. What's interesting is that they had gotten an opportunity to work in the workforce for a paycheck. And many of them thought, this is a good thing. This is something that I want for my daughter, to give her the opportunity to earn a paycheck as well, to have a profession, to work outside the home, not just in the home. So all these things were kind of coming together. Women having more political influence, women having more leisure time, or I should say not necessarily leisure time, but more time on their hands to be able to break away from the drudgery of domestic work. And then also a generation who, while they didn't continue, most of them, in the workforce for the rest of their adult lives, had gotten the opportunity to work in that workforce, and they wanted their daughters to have an education. They wanted their daughters to have the opportunity to have a career as well. Speaking of which, we've talked a little bit about women in education when we talked about Margaret Fuller, but the 19th century largely saw the creation of women's colleges all over the United States, usually two-year colleges. These were, a lot of them, I hate to say it, but a lot of them, not all, a lot of them were more like finishing schools. Southern Seminary in Virginia is one that comes to mind that I'm very familiar with. And they weren't terribly practically oriented. They were much more oriented towards equestrianism and all those kinds of the arts and things of this nature that weren't towards practical skills. Our school is really kind of a really interesting exception. It was designed specifically for working class, middle class young women to give them skills to go into the workplace. It was called the College of Industrial Arts, so that it taught young women, gave them practical skills to go and make a living, either in textiles or in agriculture or in teaching, whatever, all kinds of things like that. So you have this rise of women's colleges and seminaries. Seminaries basically largely private two-year schools. And what you saw is this evolution of the changing purpose of women's education from the 19th to the 20th century. Our school is really a very progressive example. There's Old Main up at the top. We were kind of out in front. Our school was founded in 1901 and was right at the end of the 19th century and was already ahead of this trend to move away from sort of finishing schools and etiquette schools and things like that towards a more practical education. Then, of course, the co-education movement in the 1950s and 60s, after the GI Bill came into effect after World War II, you had a lot of male students, but then you began to see more female students in colleges and universities, and many colleges that were single gender decided to go co-ed, as they call it, co-educational, in the 50s and 60s as a result of that. So all this is really important because it has an impact going forward. The 19th century moving into the 20th century sees the biggest change in the American family, in the marital, in the institution of marriage out there. Now, another thing that we want to bring up is sex and childbirth. Okay, there you go. And some of these folks are terribly interesting individuals. Down on the left, well, you've got some naughtiness going on. Even great grandpa and grandma were up to no good sometimes. And you also have some ladies of not so great repute over to the right hand side as well, and some idyllic kind of pictures of family life and things like that. Down at the bottom here, you have actually someone who has died in childbirth, and her child died. When photography was brand new, people did that. They posed dead people, and kept them as a memento. And so memento mori is what they were frequently called. That is pictures of dead folks. The Victorians were quite fond of it. You might be surprised that many middle-class educated women were more sophisticated than you might think. We think of the 19th century as that people were very naive when it came to sex. They weren't. They knew where babies came from. It's just that it wasn't something that was talked about a lot in public. It was something that you would read about, that your mother would sit down with you and have the talk. But you can imagine that even though we kind of underestimate what they knew, or how they behaved, we're probably not too far off the mark. So Annie Besant, who's up in the right-hand corner there, is an English woman who is a middle-class lady, and she said that when she got married on her wedding night, she had no more idea of the, quote, marital relation, end quote, meaning sex, than if she were a 3-year-old. That would be a shock, I think, not to prepare someone for what one normally considers the important things that transpire on one's wedding night. It is a myth, however, to say that all Victorians were terribly sexually hung up and prudish and that they didn't know anything. I mean, Queen Victoria had a really healthy sex life with Prince Albert. I mean, they had a lot of kids, okay? And you don't have a bunch of kids as a monarch, and you don't need that many insurance policies that the family's going to live on. It was because they had a very, very loving romantic relationship. They absolutely adored each other, and when he died, she was, of course, grief-stricken for the rest of her life. But, it's a myth to think that Victorians did not have healthy sexual lives, but it's also a myth to think that the way they thought about sex the way we did. It was not a thing for public consumption. It was not something you talked about in public. It was not, it would be like bathroom habits, at the dinner table. You just don't talk about that, right? To them, it would be very distasteful to talk about that. There were some very real religious and societal pressures or duties regarding childbirth. It was expected that you would bear children. It was a financial necessity for you to have children in many ways. If you were middle class, you certainly needed to have, lower class especially, you needed children. That was your retirement plan. They were going to take care of you in your old age. There were terrible risks involved in having children. The mortality rate for women in childbearing years was very, very high. The child mortality rate, infant mortality rate, was very high. It's an interesting theory that people prior to the 20th century actually didn't bond much with their children prior to being about 4 or 5 years old because they knew that it was a very real possibility they would lose them. And in fact, the infant mortality rate was somewhere in the 30, 40, 50% range in the United States in the early part of the 19th century. Everything from, whooping cough to scarlet fever to any number of different diseases that children would be very susceptible to. But it is a myth that middle class and upper middle class people did not have healthy sexual relations. It's just that sometimes married couples might not. And if there was an incompatibility there, then certainly there were very few remedies for that. So I'm going to throw you a curveball here because I'm going to give you the quiz in this video, not the next video or two, however many this ends up being. And that's because I've noticed that a lot of people are skipping to the last video looking for the quiz rather than listening to my lecture. But if you're a good student and you've listened to my lecture, then you'll know that the quiz is located at the end of this video. Here are our 3 quiz questions. What's the name of the dog in Freeman's New England Nun? What do Bibi and Bobineau go to the store to get? And why does the narrator keep smelling the wallpaper wherever she goes? We'll get around to some of these in the next video or 2, depending on how long it takes me. These are due, by the way, by Tuesday at noon. Tuesday at noon in my Yahoo account.